For years, they called me a ghost. But I was never dead, I was just listening. 7 years, 7 winters, 7 birthdays I don't remember having. I didn't say a single word. Not because I couldn't, because I knew. If I did, I'd die. First time I killed a man, I did it with my silence. I remember his face perfectly, sweat slicked, eyes wild with panic as they dragged him into the warehouse. He looked right at me, this stranger, this boy who couldn't have been older than 17. His gaze locked with mine for 3 desperate seconds. 3 seconds where he silently begged me to say something, anything, to acknowledge what was happening. Kept scrubbing the floor. I said nothing, and they slit his throat as casually as opening an envelope. That night, I added his face to my collection. Number 14. The 14th person I let die because staying alive meant keeping my mouth shut. My name is Jiho Park, but for 7 years, no one called me anything except the mute. Not because I couldn't speak, but because speaking would have gotten us January 2014, and the temperature had dropped to negative 25 degrees. The border guard I'd bribed told me to cross at precisely 2:13 a.m., the exact moment when the patrol changed shifts, and surveillance had a 3-minute blind spot. They shoot to kill, he'd warned me the day before, pocketing my mother's wedding ring. If they see you, don't run. Drop to your knees, hands up. Better to spend 10 years in a labor camp than die in that river. I had nodded, knowing he was wrong. I'd already spent 3 years in a labor camp for possessing a USB drive with South Korean dramas. I still had the scars across my back from the electric batons. There would be no second chance if I was caught. The ice groaned beneath my weight. As I crawled across, halfway through, a spotlight swept the area. I pressed my body flat against the frozen surface, not daring to breathe, the cold burning through my thin jacket. The light passed. I kept moving. When I finally reached Chinese soil, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt marked, a ghost with a heartbeat. The smuggler waiting for me on the other side. A sour, "Your accent will get you arrested in minutes, not a word, not a sound. Understand?" I nodded. "Good. The truck comes at dawn. There's a shed behind that hill. Stay there. Don't move." She vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone in a foreign land where my very voice could condemn me. That was my first night of absolute silence. I would endure 2,547 more. The pig shed was exactly what it sounded like. Filthy, freezing, and filled with the stench of animal waste. I curled up in the corner, tucking my knees to my chest, watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air. I had smuggled a photo of my family, my mother, father, and younger sister, sewn into the lining of my jacket. I couldn't risk looking at it then. Instead, I closed my eyes and tried to remember their faces. By dawn, I wasn't sure I could. The truck that arrived wasn't what I expected. It was a vegetable delivery vehicle, its back half filled with rotting cabbages. 2 men gestured for me to climb in and buried me beneath the produce. The smell was suffocating, but it masked When they finally pulled me out, we were in an industrial area outside a city I would later learn was Yanji. The driver pointed to a man waiting by a warehouse door. "Follow him," the driver said. "Work hard, stay quiet, stay alive." The man by the door had cruel eyes and a burn scar covering half his neck. He would become my first employer, my first jailer, and eventually the first name in my mental catalog of monsters. His name was Kang. The first year was the hardest. Every instinct screamed at me to speak, to assert my humanity, to ask questions when I didn't understand instructions. But silence became my religion. I communicated through gestures, nods, and what I hoped was an expression of mute obedience. Worked in Kang's warehouse, loading boxes onto trucks, cleaning floors, and sleeping in a corner behind stacks of containers. The boxes, I quickly realized, sometimes contained people. I'd hear muffled sounds, crying, pleading, breathing, as we loaded them onto trucks bound for destinations unknown. At night, I practiced mouthing words silently, community of the complicit and the trapped. There was one girl, I never learned her name, who arrived one rainy night, soaked to the bone, trembling, with eyes that reminded me of my sister's. The boss seemed unusually interested in her, speaking to her in soothing tones. She disappeared 3 days later, loaded into one of those boxes. That night, I vomited in the alley behind the warehouse, the reality of what I was part of finally breaking through my carefully maintained wall of self-preservation. Resolved to escape as soon as possible. It would take another 6 months. My opportunity came when Kang decided I was trustworthy enough, or perhaps expendable enough, to send me on a delivery run. I was to accompany one of his regular drivers to a location 2 hours away. The driver, a man named Wei, was perhaps 50, with leathery skin and nicotine-yellowed teeth. What Kang didn't know was that Wei hated him, spoke to me in broken Korean. "You understand me, yes?" I hesitated, then nodded once. "You not really mute." It wasn't a question. I stared at him, heart pounding. "I have cousin in Hunshin. He needs someone to work. Hard work, but safe. No boxes that breathe." I didn't move, certain this was a trap. Wei exhaled smoke and looked away. "I drop you there. You want? You stay. You don't want? You come back with me. I tell Kang you got sick? Your choice." 3 hours later, I was working in a small auto repair shop owned by Wei's cousin, a quiet man named Lin who never asked questions and paid me barely enough to survive. But I was away from the boxes that breathed. For now, make me speak, assuming I was born mute. I learned Mandarin by listening, by watching their lips, by studying the newspapers Lin sometimes left around the shop. At night, I would silently mouth the words I'd learned, still afraid to give voice to anything, even alone. It was there that I first started keeping track of information. Not writing, that would be too dangerous, but memorizing. License plates of suspicious vehicles, names dropped in conversations, descriptions of men who came to meet with Lin's shadier kid. One night a black SUV pulled up outside the shop. The men who stepped out wore expensive suits and carried themselves with the casual confidence of predators at the top of the food chain. One of them, taller than the rest, with a jagged scar above his right eyebrow, surveyed the garage with cold eyes. "Chen," he called out. Lin emerged from beneath a car, wiping his hands on a rag. His face had gone pale. "Mr. Wu, is the package ready?" Lin glanced nervously at where I stood in the corner, pretending to clean tools. "Almost. Just need to finish the compartment." Wu followed his gaze to me. "Who's this? Just a mute worker? He's harmless, doesn't understand anything?" Wu walked over to me, studying my face with unsettling intensity. I kept my eyes down, my posture submissive. "Look at me," he commanded. Really was. Building hidden compartments in vehicles to smuggle people and contraband. And now Wu wanted me to accompany one of these vehicles as a spotter. Someone who could identify police checkpoints, occasionally tapping his arm and pointing when I spotted police ahead. The hidden compartment behind us contained what Wu had referred to as merchandise, which, based on the occasional muffled whimper, were young women. In Beijing, we delivered the merchandise to a nondescript building in an industrial district. I kept my head down, pretending not to notice the terrified eyes of the girls as they were led inside. My stomach churned with self-loathing, but I remained impassive. The driver took me to a small apartment building on the outskirts of the city. "Stay here," he instructed, handing me a key. "Someone will contact you for the next job." The apartment was barely larger than a closet, a single room with a narrow bed, a hot plate, and a tiny bathroom. But it was the first private space I'd had in 3 years. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling with a mixture of relief and dread. That night, alone and secure for the first time in years, I whispered my name aloud. Just once. Just to remember the sound of it. Jiho. It felt foreign on my tongue, like something that belonged to someone else, someone who had died crossing that frozen river. The next morning, someone knocked at my door. I opened it to find a middle-aged woman with shrewd eyes and practical clothes. "You're the mute?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm Mrs. Zheng. I run a cleaning service. Mr. Wu says you work for me now." And just like that, I entered the next phase of my life in China. as a silent cleaner in the homes and businesses of Beijing's wealthy elite. I would soon discover that being invisible was even more valuable than being mute. Mrs. Zheng's cleaning service was a front for a sprawling intelligence network. Her cleaners worked in government offices, private clubs, corporate headquarters, what I heard. She simply checked my work, paid me a pittance, and sent me to the next location. But I knew she was collecting information, selling it to the highest bidder. It was during one of these cleaning jobs that I met the man who would change everything. His name was Choi. He was South Korean, a businessman with connections to both legitimate enterprises and the underworld. I cleaned his Beijing apartment twice a week. Unlike others, he acknowledged my presence, nodding when I entered and when I left. One day, he was arguing on the phone when I arrived. He spoke in Korean, not bothering to hide his conversation from the mute cleaner. He was discussing shipments, routes, payments, the same kind of conversations I'd overheard for years. Then he said something that froze me in place. The girl from Pyongyang, her family is asking questions. Some diplomat's niece. We need to make this go away. I kept cleaning, heart hammering in my chest. Choi continued his conversation, unaware that he'd just mentioned my hometown to someone who understood every word. When he finished his call, he glanced at me. For a terrifying moment, I thought he'd noticed my reaction, but he merely sighed and left the room. I continued cleaning, moving to his home office. On his desk lay a passport, not his, but a young woman's. The photo showed a girl of perhaps 16, with solemn eyes and the unmistakable standardized background of a North Korean ID photo. Without thinking, I memorized the name, Kim Soo-jin. That night, I broke my 7 years of silence, not with words, but with writing. I purchased a small notebook and a pen, found a secluded corner in a public park, and began recording everything I remembered. Names, locations, conversations, shipments. I hid the notebook in a plastic bag and buried it beneath a loose brick, in the alley behind my apartment. If I died tomorrow, someone might find it. Someone might know the truth. For the first time in years, I felt something other than fear. I felt purpose. 6 months passed. My notebook grew thicker. I developed a crude code, mixing Korean and Chinese characters, using numbers in place of certain names. I mapped serve at an exclusive gathering in a private room at one of Beijing's most expensive restaurants. Be invisible, she instructed, which was hardly necessary. Invisibility had become my profession. The attendees were men of obvious wealth and influence, Chinese officials, foreign businessmen, security personnel hovering discreetly in the background. I poured tea, cleared plates, and faded into the wallpaper. Halfway through the meal, a latecomer arrived. The room fell silent as he entered, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with steel gray hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Minister Gao, one of the Chinese officials said, rising to greet him, "We're honored by your presence." I kept my eyes down, my movements mechanical as I continued serving. But my mind was racing. Minister Gao, I had heard that name whispered in offices and back rooms for years. He was rumored to be untouchable, connected to the highest levels of Chinese government, and now he was here at a gathering of human traffickers. The conversation shifted to Mandarin with occasional English for the foreign guests. They discussed shipments, merchandise, special orders, the language of commerce applied to human lives. Then Minister Gao mentioned something that made my blood freeze. The South Korean intelligence service is getting too close to our Yanji. Operation? We need to shut it down temporarily. Move everything through Dandong instead. Choi, seated near the minister, nodded. What about our special guest? The one in the safe house? The diplomat's niece? Gao waved a hand dismissively. She knows nothing useful. Give her to Wu. He has a buyer interested in her. Later that night, as I lay on my narrow bed, I made a decision that would either save lives or end mine. I would try to find Kim Soo-jin, and I would break my silence to help her escape. But first I needed leverage, insurance against the powerful men I was preparing to betray. Finding the safe house took weeks of careful information gathering. I volunteered for extra cleaning shifts at buildings connected to Choi's businesses. I followed delivery trucks. I observed patterns in security personnel movements. Eventually, I identified a nondescript apartment building on the outskirts of Beijing. The ground floor was supposedly a trading company, but few people went in or out. The windows on the third floor were always covered. I returned to my apartment to find it ransacked. My few possessions were scattered across the floor, my mattress slashed open. Most alarming, the loose brick in the alley had been pried up, the hiding place for my notebook now empty. Cold panic washed over me. Someone knew. Someone had found my records. I had to run. Immediately, I grabbed my emergency bag, a small backpack containing fake ID papers, a change of clothes, and the little money I'd managed to save. I was halfway out the door when a voice spoke behind me. Park Ji-ho. I froze. It was the first time I'd heard my real name spoken aloud in 7 years. Slowly I turned. A woman stood in the shadow of my tiny kitchenette. Small, compact, with shrewd eyes and the alert posture of a fighter. She wasn't Chinese or North Korean. My name is Agent Yoon, she said in Korean. South Korean National Intelligence Service. We need to talk. I stared at her, my hand still on the doorknob. Yes, we know you can speak, she continued. We've been watching you for months. We know what you've been. Laundry service. I walked into the building carrying a toolbox. I nodded at the security guard, holding up a work order I'd forged. He barely glanced at it before waving me through. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs to the third floor. I'd prepared a cover story if questioned. The pipes in the ceiling were leaking into the unit below. I knocked on the apartment door, bracing myself for whatever might happen next. A burly man opened the door, scowling. I held up my forged work order and mimed checking the ceiling. He hesitated, then stepped aside, saying something into a radio, in Chinese. The apartment was sparsely furnished but well secured. Heavy curtains covered the windows. 2 more men sat in the living room, watching a Chinese soap opera on television. And in the corner, sitting on a chair with her hands folded. In her lap was a young woman, Kim Soo-jin, the diplomat's niece. Her eyes met mine briefly, then dropped to the floor. I moved to the bathroom, opened my toolbox, and made a show of examining the ceiling. Through the partially open door, I could see Soo-jin and hear the men talking. They largely ignored her, treating her as part of the furniture. Much as people had treated me for years, I needed to communicate with her somehow. But how could I, the mute maintenance man, speak to a captive without raising suspicion? As I pretended to work, I noticed a small notepad on the bathroom counter, likely used by the guards to communicate with Soo-jin, who wouldn't understand Chinese. I tore off a tiny piece when no one was looking and wrote in Korean. I am North. Korean, I can help you escape. Tonight, be ready. Leaving the bathroom, I deliberately tripped near Soo-jin, dropping my tools. As I gathered them up, I slipped the note beneath her chair. The guards laughed at my clumsiness. I bowed apologetically and continued my charade, checking pipes and making notations on my work order. After about 20 minutes, I indicated that I needed parts from my truck and would return. I never intended to go back, not as the maintenance man at least, but I know what you've seen, who you've heard. I remained silent, years of enforced muteness keeping my voice locked away. Agent, Yoon sighed. We don't have much time. The girl, Kim Soo-jin, is being moved tonight. If you want to help her, you need to trust me. Still, I said nothing. Fine, she said, moving toward the door. Stay silent, keep running, keep hiding. But remember this, your silence has protected you, but it's killed others. How many more will die because you refuse to speak? Her words struck like a physical blow. How many had I watched suffer while I stayed quiet? How many had disappeared into boxes that breathed? Wait, I whispered, my voice a ragged scrape after years of disuse. The sound startled us both. Agent Yoon turned back, her expression softening slightly. So you can speak, I swallowed painfully. I can help you. Find her. My first words in 7 years. They felt like broken glass in my throat. "Good," Agent Yoon said, "because we're going to get her out tonight, and then you're both coming with me." The extraction plan was simple but dangerous. While Agent Yoon and her team moved in, "What about cameras?" I asked, my voice still strange to my own ears. "We've hacked into their system. They'll see a loop of normal activity. Guards, 3 inside, 2 patrolling outside. We'll handle them." I nodded, trying to quell the terror building inside me. After 7 years of hiding, of erasing myself, I was about to step directly into danger. "Why trust me?" I asked finally. Agent Yoon studied me. "Because you've survived this long. Because you kept records when staying ignorant would have been safer. Because you're going back for her when you could have run." She handed me my toolbox upstairs, heart hammering against my ribs. Inside, the layout was as I remembered. 2 guards lounged in the living room. No sign of the third. Soo-jin sat in the same chair, but her posture was different. Alert, expectant. She'd found my note. I mimed needing to check the kitchen sink. Once there, I deliberately dropped a wrench, making a loud clap. I returned to the kitchen and turned on the water full blast, creating noise. Then I opened my toolbox, revealing not tools but a small smoke bomb, courtesy of Agent Yoon. I activated it, tossed it into the living room, and spoke clearly into my hidden earpiece. "Now." The smoke filled the room rapidly. The guards shouted, in confusion. I rushed to Soo-jin, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. We were halfway there when the third guard appeared from a back room, gun raised. "Stop," he shouted in Chinese. I froze, shielding Soo-jin with my body. The guard advanced, weapon trained on us. Through the smoke, I could see his finger tightening on the trigger. That's when the window shattered. Agent Yoon's team breached from multiple points simultaneously. The guard turned toward the new threat, and I seized the moment to tackle him, driving him to the floor. The gun discharged, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. I grappled with the guard. Agent Yoon shouted, "Now!" We rushed down the stairs, the sound of gunfire erupting behind us. Outside, a van screeched to a halt at the curb. We piled in, the doors slammed, and we were moving. Soo-jin clutched my arm, eyes wide with shock and hope. I held her hand tightly, my own body trembling with adrenaline. Agent Yoon barked orders into a radio, coordinating with other teams. Then she turned to us. "We're not safe yet." That was just the beginning. And she was right, because what I hadn't told her, what I had only begun to understand myself, was just how high this network reached, and how far its architects would go to protect it. The safe house where Agent Yoon took us was an unremarkable apartment in a densely populated district of Beijing. "Temporary," she explained. "We'll move again tomorrow." Soo-jin hadn't spoken since the rescue. She sat on a worn couch, hands folded. Police conducted random ID checks in subways and bus stations. Our faces, my face, after 7 years of careful anonymity, were distributed to security forces. We moved from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of discovery. Agent Yoon's team dwindled as members were recalled to protect the operation. Communications with Seoul became increasingly encrypted, increasingly desperate. On the 4th night, Agent Yoon received a message that chilled us all. "The embassy's been compromised," she said, her voice tight. "They have people inside, we can't go there." Soo-jin, who had been regaining her strength and spirit with each day of freedom, looked stricken. "Then we're trapped." I had been silent, thinking. "Not necessarily," I said finally. They both looked at me. "There's another way out, not through official channels." Agent Yoon frowned. "You mean the same networks that trafficked you in?" I nodded. "Some of them are just smugglers. They move people for money, not for other purposes. And you know, these people, I know how to find them." A tense silence filled the room. "It's too dangerous," Agent Yoon said finally. "More dangerous than staying here?" I countered. "They're closing in. You know it. I know it. We need to move." Soo-jin spoke. "He's right. Every day we stay, the net gets tighter." Agent Yoon paced the small room, weighing impossible options. Finally, she stopped. If, and it's a big if, we tried this route, how would it work? I outlined what I knew. Routes through Mongolia, contacts in border towns, bribes that would need to be paid. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was proposing to use the very system I'd been documenting to destroy. I don't like it, Agent Yoon said when I finished, but I like our alternatives even less. She made a decision. We move tomorrow, all of us. That night, as Soo-jin slept and Agent Yoon made final preparations, I stood at the window of our safe house looking out at the Beijing skyline. 7 years in this country, 7 years of silence and fear and watching. Not a question. I nodded. Pyongyang. Originally, they said no one would look for me, that no one would care. Your cat. Uncle. He's been searching. Her eyes welled with tears. How did you find me? I hesitated, unsure how to explain my years of silent observation, of becoming part of the furniture in rooms where terrible plans were made. I heard things, I said, simply. Things they said when they thought no one was listening. If I survived to reach Seoul. The journey was a nightmare of close calls and desperate improvisation. Agent Yoon's resources were stretched thin. My underworld contacts were suspicious of sudden urgency. Soo-jin struggled with the physical demands of the escape route. We traveled by night, hidden in cargo containers, beneath tarps in truck beds, on foot through stretches of wilderness. We changed our appearances, our papers, our stories. At the Mongolian border, disaster nearly struck. The contact I'd arranged turned out to be connected to Wu's network. He recognized me, the mute worker who suddenly could speak. He pulled a knife. What happened next still haunts me. Agent Yoon moved, with lethal efficiency. One moment the smuggler was threatening us, the next he lay still on the ground, eyes open but seeing nothing. We need to move, she said, wiping her hands. Now. But the damage was done. Word would spread. Wu would know which way we'd gone. We abandoned our planned route and headed north, toward the Russian border. Colder, more desolate, less patrolled. The journey that should have taken days stretched into weeks. Soo-jin fell ill. We sheltered in an abandoned hunting cabin while Agent Yoon foraged for medicine in a nearby village. I sat beside Soo-jin's feverish form, changing the cold compress on her forehead, willing her to survive. Agent Yoon approached, offering Soo-jin a cup of tea. Park C has been gathering intelligence on this network for years. His information will help us dismantle it. Soo-jin took the tea with trembling hands. What happens now? Now, Agent Yoon, do we get you both to South Korea? I stared at her. Both? You think you can stay in China after this? You've seen too much. Know too much. She shook her head. Besides, your family has been looking for you. My heart stopped. My family? Your sister escaped 3 years ago. She's been working with refugee groups trying to find you. The room seemed to tilt. My sister, alive, looking for me. All this time I thought I was alone in the world. Tomorrow, Agent Yoon continued, we move you both to the embassy, from there to Seoul. It sounded impossible. After 7 years of hiding, of silence, of constant fear, to simply walk into a building and be whisked to safety. It won't be that easy. I said. Agent Yoon's expression darkened. No, it won't, especially not after today. They'll be looking for both of you. Not just them, I said quietly. You don't understand how high this goes. I took a deep breath and said the words I'd been afraid to even write in my notebook. Minister Gao isn't just involved, he's in charge. The entire operation, it's state-sponsored. Agent Yoon's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her professional demeanor I'd seen. You have proof? I have what I've heard, what I've seen, names, dates, locations. I tapped my temple. All here. She studied me for a long moment. That makes you even more valuable, and an even soul. Speak, I said simply. Tell everything I know, make sure none of it was for nothing. Agent Yoon returned with antibiotics and news. Both bad. Wu's people are in the village, asking questions, showing pictures. We moved that night, despite Liu Jin's condition. We had no choice. The Russian border loomed ahead, our last major obstacle before arrangements could be made to fly us to Seoul. Agent Yoon had contacts there, people who could get us through without official scrutiny. We approached the crossing point at dawn, exhausted and on edge. Agent Yoon went ahead to meet her contact, leaving Soo-jin and me hidden among the trees. Time seemed suspended in the mist-shrouded forest. The trees, skeletal and motionless, silently watched the outcome of our escape. Soo-jin slept against my shoulder, her feverish body vacillating between delirium and torpor. I clutched my fist to my chest, where I now carried the flash drive Agent Yoon had given me, a backup of the contents of my notebook, encrypted and ready to be delivered. To the world, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the silence. It was Yoon. His face was paler than ever, but his eyes burned with an urgency that chilled my blood. "Change of plan," she said. "Contact has been compromised. They knew my name, my face. But I found another route. We're going to cross now. There's a freight train on the Russian side. If we can reach the tracks, we can." Crossing it was an act of faith. No map, no certainty. Just the confidence that on the other side there was still a world willing to listen. The moment our feet touched Russian soil, we heard the metallic crack, the dry, familiar sound of a rifle being cocked. Several. From behind rocks and branches, men emerged like specters, armed and silent. Among them was Wu. "Do you really think you could escape like this?" he said in Chinese. Then, looking at me, he switched to Korean. "You should have kept quiet, Jiho." I slowly lowered Soo-jin to the ground, shielding her body with mine. Yoon raised his hands, but his eyes were steady, calculating. "If you shoot, the world will know." With my sister was silent, not because there were no words, but because none were enough. She just hugged me. She cried. And for the first time since I left home, I cried too. I was questioned by intelligence officers, journalists, activists. My story traveled the world. But more than my voice, it was the names, the connections, the mental maps I created in 7 years of silence that made the difference. Ministers fell. Trafficking channels were dismantled. Soo-jin, with the help of therapists and support from the South Korea. Today I give lectures. I write. I use my voice, the same one I buried for so long, to amplify the voices of so many who still cannot speak. And every time I step on stage, I take a deep breath, look at the audience and say, "The first man I killed with my silence. But since then, every word I speak is for him and for all the others."